Frank Costello, the man they whispered about in smoky back rooms and marbled corridors of power, was more than a mobster. He was a phantom, a master manipulator whose reach stretched far beyond the shadowed streets of New York. Known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld, Costello navigated the perilous line between crime and politics with the grace of a diplomat and the ruthlessness of a killer, though few ever saw that darker side. Born Francesco Castiglia on January 26, 1891, in the teeming immigrant neighborhoods of Brooklyn, he emerged from poverty not through brute force, but through cunning, charisma, and an almost supernatural ability to avoid the fate that consumed so many of his contemporaries. Unlike the loud, violent gangsters immortalized in popular culture, Costello's power was subtle, invisible, and deadly precise. He didn't need headlines. He needed influence. He was the man who whispered into the ears of senators, judges, and union bosses, and those whispers often dictated the fates of entire industries. Yet beneath the polished suits and silver tongue lay a world of shadows, secret alliances, backroom betrayals, and a network of informants so complex that even the FBI struggled to untangle it. Some say Costello knew every crooked deal in New York before it happened, and he had friends in high places who ensured his operations remained untouched, at least until the law finally struck. Even his rise was marked by mysteries that never fully unraveled. How did the timid, bookish Francesco Castiglia transform into Frank Costello, the embodiment of organized crime's quiet supremacy? Early accounts suggest that his time under the notorious Frankie Yale was both mentor and warning. Yale, a gangster feared for his explosive temper and unpredictable violence, may have taught Costello the value of restraint, the power of negotiation, and the necessity of appearing unthreatening while manipulating events behind the scenes. Costello absorbed these lessons with near-perfect discipline, and by the Prohibition era, he had established himself as a broker of bootlegging empires without ever firing a gun in public, or so the legend goes. What many do not know is that Costello was rumored to have a hand in every major political and criminal transaction in New York throughout the 1930s and 1940s. From the gambling dens of Harlem to the nightclubs of Manhattan, his fingerprints were everywhere, yet he remained an enigma. Some historians argue he even saved lives, arranging deals that prevented gang wars. Others insist he orchestrated murders that eliminated rivals with surgical precision. The truth, as always, lies buried in the conflicting testimonies of associates, the blurred lines between loyalty and fear, and the selective memory of those who survived the underworld long enough to tell their tales. Then came the infamous Appalachian Meeting of 1957, an event that both cemented and threatened Costello's empire. Some say he tipped off the authorities, sparking a raid that exposed the inner workings of organized crime to the public for the first time. Was it a strategic move to protect himself while sacrificing others, or was he simply one step ahead of inevitable scrutiny? The debate continues, shrouded in secrecy and speculation, a perfect example of the ambiguity that surrounded him. Costello's downfall was as dramatic as his rise. In 1957, a failed assassination attempt left him wounded but alive, a rare miscalculation in a career defined by foresight. This attack, ordered by rivals within his own family, symbolized the fragility of even the most carefully constructed criminal empires. For the first time, the man who had controlled New York from the shadows faced the harsh glare of vulnerability, and his subsequent dealings showed the meticulous recalibration of a survivor. He didn't respond with vengeance immediately. Instead, he maneuvered subtly, leveraging political allies and exploiting divisions among his enemies, proving again that his true weapon was influence, not violence. And yet, Costello was not invincible. In a world dominated by brutality, even the cleverest fox can be cornered. The same skills that had allowed him to thrive, the charm, the negotiation, the ability to appear harmless, could not shield him forever from the shifting tides of criminal loyalty, law enforcement pressure, and political intrigue. His later years were marked by declining health, growing suspicion, and a persistent sense that the empire he had built could crumble without warning. Beneath the public persona and media caricature, Frank Costello remained a puzzle. His life was a labyrinth of contradictions, A family man with the heart of a strategist, a lawbreaker who understood the workings of justice, a powerful figure who thrived by remaining unseen. Even decades later, his legend continues to fascinate scholars, journalists, and storytellers alike, not merely because of the crimes he orchestrated, but because of the way he wielded power in a world where power often came with a gun. Despite his quiet demeanor, Frank Costello's influence over the American mafia was nothing short of extraordinary. While others relied on brute force, Costello preferred subtlety in invisible hand-guiding events from the shadows. He cultivated an aura of legitimacy, often presenting himself as a businessman or political advisor, masking the immense underworld network he commanded. One of the most remarkable aspects of Costello's career was his relationship with Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the architect of modern organized crime in America. While Luciano was often associated with violence and decisive action, Costello complemented him with finesse and strategy, creating a partnership that allowed the mafia to thrive under a veneer of respectability. Costello's role as the political fixer of New York cannot be understated. He understood the art of influence better than anyone of his era, quietly forging ties with judges, police officials, and Tammany Hall politicians. Some historians argue that he wielded more real power than elected officials, orchestrating decisions that affected both the legal and illegal economy of the city. Rumors persist that Costello could have been responsible for the appointment of certain judges and the blocking of others. Though no proof exists, the pattern of outcomes favored his operations too consistently to be mere coincidence. One of the most tantalizing and controversial episodes of his career was the infamous Appalachian Meeting in 1957. Organized to consolidate mafia leadership nationwide, the meeting ended in disaster when law enforcement stumbled upon hundreds of mob bosses in upstate New York. Some accounts suggest that Costello, ever the strategist, may have tipped off authorities to avoid attending personally, allowing him to maintain plausible deniability while his rivals faced public exposure. Was this a clever maneuver to protect himself, or a betrayal of allies? The truth remains a mystery, and it is this ambiguity that fuels the enduring fascination with Costello's persona. Costello's meticulous control over gambling, racketeering, and bootlegging operations made him one of the wealthiest mobsters of his time. Yet, he remained surprisingly discreet. Unlike his more flamboyant counterparts, he rarely flaunted wealth. Stories of his opulent lifestyle are sparse, but those close to him recount a man who preferred influence over display. His true luxury lay in power, the ability to make and break fortunes, to decide who would rise and who would fall, often without anyone suspecting his involvement. Yet, his carefully constructed empire was not immune to betrayal. In 1957, Vito Genovese, a rising and ambitious figure within the mafia, orchestrated an assassination attempt against Costello. Gunfire shattered the quiet of a lower Manhattan street, leaving Costello wounded but alive, a testament to his resilience and luck. This attack marked the beginning of his slow decline from the peak of his power. While he continued to exert influence, his ability to command fear and loyalty diminished in the face of rising enemies and changing times. Costello's life was punctuated by paradoxes. He was a man capable of extreme violence, yet preferred diplomacy. He amassed power through crime, yet understood the intricacies of lawful governance. He survived countless attempts on his life, yet ultimately succumbed to natural causes, leaving behind a legacy wrapped in secrecy. Those who knew him often described a duality: the genial, silver-tongued negotiator, and the ruthless strategist who could orchestrate murder without lifting a finger. Even in death, Costello's mystique endures. His funeral drew prominent figures from both the criminal underworld and legitimate society, illustrating the breadth of his influence. To this day, historians and crime writers debate the true extent of his power. Did he quietly run New York behind closed doors? Did he manipulate politicians and law enforcement with an unseen hand? Or was he simply a master of perception, a man who understood that the illusion of control is sometimes as potent as control itself? What remains undeniable is that Frank Costello redefined what it meant to be a mobster. He demonstrated that in a world dominated by guns and intimidation, the real Kingpin is often the one who moves silently, calculating every step, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, or to avoid being struck. His life, filled with shadowy alliances, secret deals, and whispered threats, continues to inspire fascination, myth, and controversy. Behind the public persona of the Prime Minister of the Underworld, Frank Costello's personal life was surprisingly complex. Despite his reputation as a ruthless mob strategist, those closest to him often described a man of refinement and loyalty, a devoted husband, a protective father, and a figure who maintained a delicate balance between family and crime. He married Francesca M. Russo, a woman who endured the constant shadow of danger that loomed over her husband's life, and together they had children, though few outside the inner circle knew much about them. Costello was careful to shield his family from the darker realities of his empire, insisting that they live lives as normal as possible. Some say this was his greatest skill, to compartmentalize, to exist in two worlds simultaneously, the brutal underworld and the genteel domestic sphere. Yet, even at home, the fingerprints of the criminal world were never entirely absent. Friends and associates would sometimes visit under the guise of business meetings, while bodyguards discreetly patrolled the neighborhood. Stories from those who glimpsed Costello in his private life reveal a man who enjoyed classical music, fine dining, and intellectual conversation, a stark contrast to the violent rumors that surrounded him in newspapers. He cultivated a refined taste, perhaps as a counterbalance to the moral compromises of his professional life, and some historians suggest that his cultured demeanor was a conscious strategy to enhance his image as a trustworthy and persuasive negotiator. Costello's influence extended far beyond New York streets. His connections reached into Hollywood, where he is rumored to have mediated disputes over labor unions and gambling interests connected to the film industry. Actors, producers, and studio executives often found themselves indirectly under his sway, and though he rarely sought publicity, his name carried weight in circles that would seem unrelated to organized crime. Allegedly, Costello could facilitate deals, protect interests, and ensure loyalty, all without ever appearing in the headlines. Some speculate that his involvement in Hollywood was a calculated move to diversify influence, to create a veneer of legitimacy that would further insulate him from legal scrutiny. However, the pressures of maintaining such a dual existence inevitably took a toll. The 1950s saw the mafia landscape shift dramatically, with rising figures like Vito Genovese challenging the old guard. Costello's near assassination in 1957, an event that left him wounded in his own neighborhood, signaled a turning point. For the first time, the man who had so carefully manipulated both crime and politics faced the brutal reality that loyalty in the underworld was fleeting and power could be violently contested. Yet even after this attack, Costello did not retaliate immediately. He relied on patience, political connections, and strategic alliances, demonstrating once again that his greatest weapon was not a gun, but influence, the ability to bend events to his will without drawing attention. The final decades of Costello's life were marked by a slow withdrawal from active control. Health concerns and the relentless pressure of law enforcement gradually eroded his ability to operate openly. By the 1960s, his presence in organized crime had become more symbolic than operational, though his counsel remained valued by younger mobsters who recognized the wisdom in his experience. Costello's ability to endure, adapt, and command respect, even as his empire waned, speaks to a rare combination of intelligence, charisma, and foresight. Costello's death in 1973, from natural causes, closed the chapter on one of the most enigmatic lives in American criminal history. Yet even in death, the aura of mystery persisted. To this day, historians debate the full extent of his influence. Was he the true architect behind countless political decisions and mafia operations? Or was he a master of perception, allowing others to take the blame while he quietly shaped events from the background? Perhaps the most compelling answer lies in the contradictions that defined him. A man both feared and admired, ruthless yet charming, visible yet invisible. Even decades later, Costello's life continues to captivate the imagination. His story is a testament to the power of intellect over violence, negotiation over confrontation, and subtlety over spectacle. In a world where most gangsters met violent ends, Frank Costello's survival and longevity illustrate the ultimate mastery: to wield power while remaining untouchable, to command attention without inviting scrutiny, and to exist in the shadows of history as both participant and architect. By the late 1950s, Frank Costello's quiet dominance over New York's underworld faced its greatest challenge. Vito Genovese, a ruthless and ambitious figure within the mafia, had been biding his time, waiting for the perfect opportunity to seize power. Genovese represented a new era of organized crime, brutal, assertive, and unafraid to challenge the old guard. Costello, for all his intelligence and cunning, could not ignore the growing threat. Unlike previous rivals, Genovese did not rely solely on negotiation. He understood that in the mafia, perception of strength could be as decisive as actual force. The tension between the two men reached a violent climax on May 2, 1957. Costello, walking along a familiar Lower Manhattan street, was ambushed. Two gunmen opened fire, sending bullets through the quiet morning. Costello was struck in the throat, leaving him gravely wounded but astonishingly alive. The assassination attempt shocked the criminal world. The audacity of the attack on the Prime Minister himself signaled a shift in power dynamics. Those who once obeyed Costello without question now hesitated, uncertain whether the man who had ruled from the shadows would survive or yield to his enemies. Miraculously, Costello survived, but the attack marked the beginning of his decline. No longer could he maneuver freely without fear. Genovese's boldness had destabilized the balance Costello had maintained for decades. In the ensuing months, Costello withdrew from active leadership, using his political connections to protect himself, while Genovese consolidated control. Some argue that Costello's restraint, his decision not to retaliate immediately, was a demonstration of strategic patience. He understood that overt revenge might escalate violence and threaten his life further. Yet, for all his foresight, the streets had begun to belong to Genovese and his allies. The aftermath of the assassination attempt revealed the fragility of even the most carefully built criminal empires. Costello's loyalists faced difficult choices: remain aligned with a weakened but respected leader, or pledge allegiance to the emerging power of Genovese. Many chose survival over loyalty, quietly switching sides, leaving Costello to navigate a treacherous landscape where trust was a rare commodity. The man who had once dictated terms to everyone in the underworld now had to rely almost entirely on old alliances and political influence. Despite his reduced role, Costello continued to exert subtle control. He was a master of indirect influence, advising from behind the scenes, mediating disputes, and using his network to ensure that his former enterprises remained largely intact. Yet the world around him had changed irrevocably. The era of Costello's quiet dominance was over. The mafia had entered a phase of violent assertiveness, and the old rules of negotiation and discretion were increasingly replaced by open displays of power. The final years of Costello's life were marked by this uneasy balance. Respected, yet sidelined. Influential, yet vulnerable. He lived quietly in Manhattan, rarely attending public events and carefully shielding his family from the chaos that had once defined his career. Some accounts suggest that he remained an advisor to figures in the mafia well into the 1960s, a testament to the enduring value of his knowledge and political savvy. Even as the world he had ruled shifted around him, Costello maintained a degree of control simply through his reputation, a reminder that true power often lies not in visibility, but in the perception of it. Frank Costello's death in 1973 brought an end to a life steeped in contradiction and mystery. For decades, he had navigated a world of violence, betrayal, and political manipulation with a skill unmatched by most of his contemporaries. Unlike other mobsters who died violently, Costello passed quietly, leaving behind a legacy that continues to fascinate historians, writers, and the public alike. His story remains a testament to the extraordinary combination of intelligence, patience, and strategic vision required to survive and thrive in the shadowy world of organized crime. Even today, his legend persists. Scholars and storytellers debate the true extent of his influence. Was he the puppet master behind countless political decisions and criminal enterprises? Or was he a man who understood how to create the illusion of control so convincingly that it became indistinguishable from reality? Perhaps the answer lies in the enduring contradictions of Frank Costello himself. a man capable of immense ruthlessness, yet charming and cultured, a strategist who avoided the spotlight, yet commanded attention wherever he went, a kingpin who ruled not with fear alone, but with intellect, diplomacy, and the subtle art of influence. In the end, Frank Costello remains an enigma, a figure who walked in both light and shadow, whose life exemplified the delicate balance between power and perception. His story is not just a tale of crime, but a chronicle of survival, adaptation, and the extraordinary capacity of one man to command respect in a world defined by violence. The streets of New York may have moved on, but the legacy of the Prime Minister of the Underworld continues to echo, a reminder that in the game of power, intelligence and strategy often outlive guns and bullets. Frank Costello's legacy is a story written in shadows and whispers. Though he died quietly in 1973, far removed from the bullets and chaos that claimed so many of his contemporaries, the world he shaped continued to reverberate long after his passing. Unlike the flamboyant, violent mobsters immortalized on screen, Costello's genius lay in invisibility, the ability to manipulate, negotiate, and orchestrate power without ever appearing to seize it. In many ways, he was the architect of the modern mafia, setting patterns of influence, alliance, and control that would endure for decades. Hollywood and popular culture have long been fascinated by figures like Costello. Characters in classic films, most famously the suave, strategic Don Vito Corleone, bear traces of his persona, the calm authority, the measured words, the hidden hand-guiding events, while the world believes in chaos. Costello was the embodiment of a different kind of power, one that depended not on notoriety but on reputation, perception, and the careful cultivation of loyalty. To historians, writers, and crime enthusiasts, his story is a blueprint for understanding the subtle art of leadership in a violent world. Yet for all the fame and legend, mysteries remain. Scholars debate the extent of his political reach. How many appointments, decisions, and deals were swayed by his counsel or threats? Some believe Costello had more influence over New York politics than any mayor, senator, or judge of his era. Others argue that his genius was creating the illusion of omnipresence, convincing both enemies and allies that he was everywhere, listening to everything, always one step ahead. The truth, like much of Costello's life, is layered in ambiguity. A puzzle where every piece seems to fit, yet the final picture remains tantalizingly out of reach. Costello's life also raises profound questions about morality, survival, and the nature of power. He was a man capable of immense ruthlessness, yet he valued diplomacy over violence, strategy over brute force. He built alliances with politicians, entertainers, and business leaders, blurring the lines between legality and criminality. And he did it in a way that ensured his survival in a world where most of his peers met violent, untimely ends. To some, this makes him a visionary. To others, a manipulative enigma whose ethical boundaries were defined only by personal gain and self-preservation. The streets of New York may have changed, but the influence of Frank Costello lingers. Organized crime, politics, and even popular imagination continue to echo the patterns he established. The silent power broker, the negotiator behind closed doors, the man who commanded loyalty without fear alone. In a city defined by conflict, where allegiances shift like shadows, Costello's story is a testament to the enduring power of intellect, patience, and perception. As the world remembers him, Frank Costello remains an enigma, a man who defied the violent expectations of his profession by mastering the subtler arts of influence. His life challenges our understanding of power, that true dominance is not always visible, that survival in a brutal world is as much about strategy and patience as it is about courage or aggression. In the annals of organized crime, few figures combine cunning, diplomacy, and subtlety as seamlessly as Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the Underworld, whose legacy continues to captivate, mystify, and inspire generations. Perhaps the greatest mystery of all is that even after decades, his story refuses to be fully unraveled. Was he the ultimate strategist, manipulating events from behind the curtain of everyday life? Or was he a man who simply understood how to survive where others fell? In the world he inhabited, those questions may never be answered. And perhaps that is the final mark of his genius. Frank Costello did not just wield power, he transformed it into legend. While many remember Frank Costello as the Prime Minister of the Underworld, few realize the subtlety with which he controlled not just criminal enterprises, but also the very pulse of New York itself. He had a talent for understanding people, for reading the ambitions, fears, and weaknesses of both allies and rivals. This ability allowed him to manipulate outcomes with precision, ensuring that even those who thought themselves free actors in their own lives often danced to Costello's unseen tune. Costello's network was vast and intricate. From the gambling dens of Brooklyn to the nightclubs of Manhattan and the illegal lotteries of Harlem, he had operatives everywhere, often unknown even to each other. This decentralization was deliberate. No single subordinate held the full picture, ensuring loyalty through dependency and secrecy. It was an empire built not on terror alone, but on trust, persuasion, and occasionally silent threats. He preferred negotiation to gunfire, understanding that the true power of a mobster lay not in immediate conquest, but in lasting influence. Even within the mafia, Costello's approach was revolutionary. While figures like Lucky Luciano relied on fear and brute force to maintain control, Costello emphasized diplomacy. He mediated disputes between rival factions, often brokering peace deals that preserved the profitability of criminal operations. Some historians argue that without Costello's interventions, the mafia wars of the 1930s and 1940s would have been far bloodier and more destabilizing. His contemporaries called him the brains of the outfit, yet the title, Prime Minister, also reflected a political elegance. He ran the mafia like a government in miniature, balancing competing interests, maintaining alliances, and punishing betrayal with quiet precision. One of the lesser-known facets of Costello's influence was his ability to infiltrate and manipulate legitimate institutions. He cultivated relationships with union leaders, city officials, and law enforcement alike. Some accounts suggest that he influenced city contracts, labor disputes, and even judicial appointments. These interactions were never overt. Costello understood that subtlety ensured longevity. By the 1950s, he had become a man whose approval, or quiet disapproval, could shape not just criminal outcomes, but economic and political ones. Despite his careful approach, danger always lingered. Vito Genovese's rise highlighted the fragile nature of loyalty within the mafia. Costello had countless allies, yet some were swayed by promises of power or intimidated by the threat of violence. The 1957 assassination attempt that left Costello wounded in Manhattan underscored the perils of underestimating ambitious rivals. It was a violent reminder that in the criminal underworld, respect and fear are mutable commodities, and even the most skilled strategist must occasionally yield to circumstance. Costello's handling of the aftermath of the attempt is both fascinating and telling. Rather than retaliate with immediate violence, he leveraged his extensive network of political contacts, law enforcement allies, and loyalists to maintain influence. He understood that an overt response could provoke further attacks, destabilize his remaining power, and draw unwelcome attention from federal authorities. Instead, he relied on negotiation, calculated pressure, and subtle manipulation, demonstrating once more that true control often resides in patience and perception rather than brute strength. At the same time, his personal life continued in parallel, almost like a counterpoint to the violence and tension that surrounded him. Costello took meticulous care to protect his family from the underworld he commanded. His home life, as recounted by acquaintances, was surprisingly normal. Family dinners, quiet walks, and a strong emphasis on loyalty and education for his children. Yet, even in these domestic spaces, traces of his criminal world remained. Trusted associates would visit under the guise of business, bodyguards patrolled discreetly, and the omnipresent sense of danger lingered like a shadow. This dual existence, navigating both the elegance of domestic life and the brutality of organized crime, was one of Costello's defining characteristics, demonstrating his extraordinary capacity for compartmentalization. Costello's impact extended into cultural spheres as well. Rumors of his involvement in Hollywood labor disputes, gambling rings linked to film studios, and even the financing of certain productions suggest that his influence went far beyond traditional crime territories. While the details are murky, it is widely believed that he used these connections to expand his network, diversify his sources of income, and cement his reputation as a man who could get things done across both legitimate and illegitimate domains. Even during his decline, after Genovese had assumed much of the overt power within the mafia, Costello remained a force to be reckoned with. Younger mobsters continued to seek his advice, recognizing the value of his knowledge, connections, and experience. Though his role was less visible, his presence remained a stabilizing force, proof that influence can outlast aggression and subtlety can outmaneuver brute strength. Frank Costello's death in 1973 did not mark the end of his story. His life continues to inspire fascination, myth, and scholarly debate. Was he the true puppet master behind New York politics? Did he secretly control more of the mafia's operations than anyone dared to admit? Or was he simply a man who understood the art of perception so well that it became indistinguishable from reality? These questions, like much of Costello's life, may never be fully answered. Even those closest to Frank Costello often spoke of him with a mixture of awe and fear. He had an almost preternatural sense of timing, an uncanny ability to predict when a deal might go wrong, when a rival might betray him, or when law enforcement might intervene. One story recounts a meeting in the 1940s with a group of rival gangsters who believed they could intimidate Costello into surrendering part of his gambling empire. Instead of responding with threats or violence, Costello calmly listened, offered a modest compromise, and walked away, leaving his adversaries baffled. By the end of the week, the same rivals had quietly acknowledged his authority, convinced that any attempt to undermine him would be disastrous. Costello's talents were not limited to negotiation. He was also a master of surveillance and information. Rumors persist that he maintained a network of informants, not only within rival gangs, but also in political offices, law enforcement, and even media outlets. Newspapers and police records hint at meetings that never officially happened, telephone calls that were never traced, and decisions that inexplicably favored his operations. Some historians speculate that Costello may have influenced outcomes, ranging from city contracts to union appointments, though the evidence is circumstantial. This ambiguity, this blend of fact and legend, is precisely what elevated him from mere gangster to mythic figure. Another lesser-known aspect of Costello's life was his role in protecting, or at least mediating, conflicts between competing factions during the Prohibition era and the years that followed. While many mobsters of the time favored open violence to expand territory, Costello understood that unnecessary bloodshed threatened long-term profit. He brokered agreements between rival bootlegging operations and gambling rings, creating a fragile but enduring peace that allowed the mafia to flourish under a veneer of stability. Some contemporaries described him as the unseen hand that kept the streets from spilling too much blood, a paradoxical title for a man who, at the same time, orchestrated murders when strategy demanded it. Costello's subtlety extended even to his health and personal safety. After surviving the 1957 assassination attempt orchestrated by Vito Genovese, he reportedly adopted routines designed to make himself unpredictable. He traveled through Manhattan at odd hours, altered his walking routes, and relied on bodyguards whose presence was discreet but constant. The attack left him scarred, not just physically, but in terms of trust, reminding him that in a world of shifting loyalties, survival depended as much on anticipation as on negotiation. Yet, despite the danger surrounding him, Costello's social skills remained unmatched. He was a fixture at exclusive nightclubs and restaurants, often entertaining celebrities, politicians, and influential businessmen. These interactions were never purely social. They were opportunities to consolidate influence, gather intelligence, and subtly steer conversations in directions favorable to him. Hollywood actors, union leaders, and city officials would find themselves unwittingly part of a larger web that Costello spun with effortless grace. To outsiders, he appeared charming and unassuming. To insiders, he was a man whose word carried weight no gun could match. Costello's relationship with other mafia families also reveals the depth of his political acumen. While many gangsters relied solely on fear to maintain order, Costello relied on respect and loyalty. He fostered alliances across ethnic and regional lines, understanding that cooperation, however tenuous, was more profitable than conflict. This approach occasionally placed him at odds with more aggressive figures, but it also allowed him to survive assassinations, betrayals, and law enforcement pressure that would have destroyed others. The paradox of Costello's life is striking. He wielded power in a violent world, yet preferred diplomacy. He profited from illegal enterprises, yet cultivated a public image of civility. He commanded fear, yet thrived on respect and perception. Even in his final years, as his health declined and younger, more violent figures rose within the mafia, he remained a respected advisor, sought for guidance by those navigating the treacherous waters of organized crime. Rumors about Costello's influence extend beyond organized crime. Some historians and journalists have suggested that he may have had indirect involvement in political scandals, election outcomes, and even labor strikes. While concrete proof is scarce, the pattern of results often favored his interests. Whether through intimidation, persuasion, or subtle manipulation, Costello demonstrated that power is often most effective when invisible, a theme that defined his life from the crowded streets of Brooklyn to the polished corridors of New York's elite. Perhaps the most enduring mystery of Frank Costello is how he managed to survive and even thrive in an environment designed to consume men like him. His contemporaries fell to bullets, prison sentences, or betrayal. He endured. Some attribute it to luck, others to genius. But the truth likely lies in a combination of intuition, strategic foresight, and an unerring understanding of human nature. Costello was a man who could calculate risk with extraordinary precision, anticipate moves before they were made, and use the appearance of weakness as a weapon. Even after decades, his legend continues to inspire fascination. Frank Costello was not just a gangster. He was a strategist, a diplomat, and an enigma. His story reminds us that in the world of power, whether criminal or political, subtlety, patience, and perception can outweigh force, and that the greatest leaders are often those who act from the shadows. Frank Costello's life was inseparable from the complex web of politics, crime, and society that defined mid-20th century New York. Unlike many mobsters who acted impulsively, Costello understood the power of indirect control. He maintained extensive political connections, some of which reached the highest levels of government. While few can document every action he influenced, anecdotes suggest that Costello's advice, or quiet pressure, helped shape judicial appointments, union leadership, and city contracts. Some stories even suggest he had the ability to sway elections, not through direct corruption, but through the careful orchestration of alliances, threats, and strategic favors. The Prohibition era had taught Costello that influence often mattered more than force. By the 1940s and 1950s, he had refined this understanding to perfection. When organized crime needed a resolution that violence alone could not achieve, Costello would step in, acting as an invisible mediator. His presence reassured allies and intimidated rivals simultaneously. This subtlety earned him both admiration and resentment. To the younger, more aggressive figures like Vito Genovese, Costello's method was outdated, a symbol of caution in a world that increasingly rewarded ruthlessness. The infamous Appalachian meeting in 1957 further illustrates Costello's shadowy brilliance. The meeting, intended to consolidate mafia leadership across the United States, ended in disaster when law enforcement unexpectedly raided the gathering. Hundreds of mobsters were arrested or exposed, a shocking public revelation of organized crime's scale. Costello, however, avoided attending personally. Some scholars speculate he tipped off authorities, not out of disloyalty, but as a calculated move to preserve his safety while allowing rivals to face scrutiny. Others argue he simply exercised caution, a trait that had saved his life countless times before. The ambiguity of his role in the affair contributes to the enduring mystery surrounding him. Costello's empire was not built solely on negotiation and political maneuvering. He also had a shrewd eye for economics. Gambling, racketeering, and bootlegging were not merely sources of income, they were instruments of power. Costello understood that controlling money meant controlling people, and he deployed resources strategically to ensure loyalty and suppress dissent. Some accounts claim that he even influenced legitimate business decisions, using investments and partnerships to extend his reach into areas beyond traditional organized crime. Despite this outwardly calculated life, Costello's existence was not without danger or intrigue. Rumors circulated of secret meetings with politicians, judges, and union leaders in which decisions of immense consequence were quietly influenced. In certain cases, a nod from Costello was enough to determine the outcome of a labor dispute or the approval of a municipal contract. Yet, no public record ever definitively confirmed his involvement, which only enhanced the aura of myth surrounding him. Even the younger generation of mobsters recognized Costello's genius. They sought his counsel, knowing that decades of experience had given him insights far beyond their own. While Genovese and others favored overt violence and intimidation, Costello's strength lay in subtlety, anticipating moves, exploiting rivalries, and negotiating outcomes without ever drawing attention. His enduring influence was proof that in both crime and politics, perception often outweighs force. Costello's life also inspired Hollywood and popular culture. Filmmakers and writers drew upon his persona when crafting the archetype of the strategic, enigmatic mob boss. The calm, calculating Don Vito Corleone, immortalized in The Godfather, carries echoes of Costello's blend of charm, intellect, and quiet authority. Yet, unlike many cinematic portrayals, Costello operated without theatrics. He understood the value of discretion, cultivating a reputation for civility even as he orchestrated complex criminal enterprises. By the time of his death in 1973, Frank Costello had survived assassination attempts, betrayal by allies, and relentless law enforcement scrutiny. He outlived most of his contemporaries, leaving behind a legacy not of sheer brutality, but of cunning, foresight, and strategic mastery. Scholars debate the full extent of his influence, but few deny that he reshaped the landscape of organized crime. His story demonstrates that intelligence, patience, and perception can be as lethal as any weapon. Even decades later, the legend of Frank Costello endures. Was he a puppet master, quietly directing events from the shadows? Was he simply a man who understood human nature better than anyone else, allowing him to survive where others fell? The truth is likely a combination of both. A man whose brilliance lay in blending strategy, charm, and ruthless pragmatism. In the annals of organized crime, few figures command the same mixture of fear, respect, and fascination. Frank Costello did not just survive the mafia. He defined an era of it, proving that the greatest power often resides in subtlety, foresight, and the mastery of perception. Frank Costello's influence did not die with him. In many ways, it continues to shape the mythos of organized crime today. Younger mobsters studied his methods, recognizing the power of diplomacy, subtlety, and strategic foresight. Unlike those who relied on public displays of violence, Costello's approach demonstrated that controlling perception could be as powerful as controlling territory. His successors often tried to emulate the quiet authority he wielded, though few matched his precision, patience, and ability to foresee events before they unfolded. The cultural echoes of Costello's life are unmistakable. Hollywood, always fascinated by organized crime, drew inspiration from the Prime Minister of the Underworld for generations of films, novels, and television series. Characters modeled after him emphasized intelligence, negotiation, and the careful orchestration of power behind the scenes, qualities that set him apart from the stereotypical gangster of brute force. The idea of a mob boss who could sway politicians, manage empires, and survive assassination attempts became a template for the cinematic archetype: calm, measured, and invisible yet omnipotent. Despite the legend, Costello's story is also a study in human complexity. He was at once ruthless and refined, dangerous and diplomatic, feared and admired. He navigated a world where betrayal was constant, alliances were fragile, and violence was ever present. Yet, he survived where so many others perished. His longevity was not mere luck. It was the product of intellect, meticulous planning, and an unparalleled understanding of human nature. Costello demonstrated that in the game of power, foresight and subtlety often outweigh aggression, and influence often surpasses force. Some of the most compelling aspects of Costello's legacy are the rumors and mysteries that remain. Scholars debate the extent of his involvement in political scandals, labor disputes, and municipal decisions. Anecdotes suggest he may have influenced outcomes of elections, labor contracts, and even judicial appointments. While definitive proof is scarce, the consistent pattern of results benefiting his interests adds weight to these claims. These ambiguities only enhance the aura of legend, leaving historians and storytellers alike to wonder just how much control he truly wielded. Even his surviving contemporaries acknowledged his skill. Those who lived under his shadow often spoke of a man who could bend the world with a whisper. Rivals and allies alike recognized that Costello's power lay not in the ability to intimidate physically, but in the ability to manipulate perception, anticipate moves, and leverage relationships. He understood that influence, quiet, invisible, and pervasive, could outlast any gunfight, assassination, or overt show of force. Frank Costello also demonstrated a remarkable ability to compartmentalize. He could exist simultaneously in the violent underworld of organized crime and the refined circles of politics, entertainment, and society. Family life, though protected from much of the chaos, was not untouched. Yet, Costello carefully maintained this balance, proving that even a life enmeshed in crime could accommodate elements of normalcy if navigated with intelligence and discretion. In the end, Frank Costello's life is a masterclass in strategy, perception, and survival. He achieved a level of power that few have ever matched, not by brute force, but by intellect, negotiation, and an understanding of human behavior. His influence shaped not only the operations of the mafia in mid-20th century America, but also the way popular culture would depict organized crime for generations to come. The legend of the Prime Minister of the Underworld persists precisely because his life was filled with contradictions: a criminal who commanded respect, a strategist who survived violence, a man whose influence was invisible yet undeniable. Today, historians, journalists, and storytellers continue to debate Frank Costello's life. But one thing is certain: he redefined what it meant to wield power in the criminal world. His story is not simply about crime. It is about mastery, survival, and the subtle art of influence. In a world dominated by fear, Costello proved that calm intelligence, patience, and foresight could achieve what violence alone could not. The mystery surrounding him remains perhaps the most captivating part of all. Was he truly the puppet master behind countless political and criminal decisions? Or was he a man whose skill at perception created the illusion of control so convincingly that the world believed he held absolute power? The answer, like so much of his life, is ambiguous. A fitting legacy for a man whose brilliance was measured not by what was seen, but by what was felt, whispered, and feared in the shadows. Frank Costello did not just survive the mafia. He transcended it. His life remains a testament to the enduring power of intellect, diplomacy, and the quiet, invisible hand. In the annals of organized crime, he is remembered not merely as a gangster, but as a strategist, a negotiator, and an enigma, a figure whose legend will endure as long as stories of power, betrayal, and survival are told. Frank Costello's final years were marked by a quiet intensity, a stark contrast to the life of intrigue, violence, and power that had defined his rise. Though he had survived assassination attempts, betrayal, and decades of law enforcement scrutiny, he could never completely escape the shadow of the underworld. Even in retirement, the streets whispered his name, and younger gangsters, some ambitious, some fearful, continued to measure themselves against his legacy. It was as if the city itself recognized the imprint of his genius, a presence invisible but undeniable, lingering in the corridors of power, in smoky back rooms, and in the careful calculations of those who came after him. In private, Costello maintained the rituals and routines of a man who understood the fragility of life. Friends and family recalled evenings spent in quiet reflection, sometimes with music playing softly in the background, sometimes in silence. There were moments when he would walk the familiar streets of Manhattan, observing the world without ever being fully observed himself. These walks were more than leisurely strolls. They were exercises in vigilance, a subtle practice honed over decades in a world where even the slightest miscalculation could prove fatal. Each interaction, each glance, each word spoken was measured, calculated, and evaluated. To live in Costello's world was to exist under the scrutiny of a mind that never rested. The paradox of Costello's existence remained striking until the end. He was a man whose influence shaped the lives of thousands, yet his power was invisible to most. Politicians, judges, union leaders, and business figures often acted in ways that suggested an unseen hand guiding events, though the evidence could never definitively confirm his involvement. Organized crime figures who had once feared him continued to speak of him with reverence, acknowledging that his intellect and strategic vision were unmatched. Even his rivals admitted that Costello had survived longer than anyone should have in a world designed to consume men like him. Costello's personal life, carefully shielded from public scrutiny, also reflected the duality of his existence. He remained a devoted husband and father, protective of those he loved, even as he navigated a perilous world. Friends and family recall a man capable of warmth, generosity, and humor, a stark contrast to the ruthless strategist feared by enemies. He could laugh, counsel, and comfort, yet beneath that calm exterior lay a mind constantly analyzing, calculating, and anticipating. It was this duality, family man and criminal mastermind, that made him so enigmatic, so enduringly fascinating. Even the assassination attempt orchestrated by Vito Genovese in 1957, which could have ended his life, only reinforced the aura surrounding Costello. Surviving such an attack was remarkable in itself, but his subsequent restraint, patience, and subtle maneuvering demonstrated a rare understanding of power dynamics. He did not retaliate with brute force. Instead, he relied on strategy, connections, and the careful preservation of influence. In doing so, he not only survived, but continued to exert subtle control over events for years afterward. This ability to adapt, to operate invisibly, and to remain relevant despite adversity solidified his reputation as one of the most intelligent figures in American organized crime. The cultural legacy of Frank Costello is equally compelling. Writers, filmmakers, and journalists drew inspiration from his life, crafting characters and narratives that emphasized cunning, strategy, and the quiet exercise of power. The archetype of the intelligent, calculating mobster, the figure who controls events without overt violence, owes much to Costello's persona. Even today, when audiences watch films about organized crime, they see echoes of Costello's life in characters who operate in the shadows, negotiating, manipulating, and surviving with a grace that few can emulate. Yet, for all the legends and stories, the ultimate truth of Costello's influence remains elusive. Did he control New York's political and criminal spheres with unmatched precision? Or was his genius in creating the illusion of control so convincing that others deferred to him willingly? Perhaps the question itself is a testament to his brilliance. Frank Costello understood that perception can be as potent as reality, and he wielded that understanding with the mastery of a conductor guiding an orchestra unseen. In the end, Frank Costello died not as a figure hunted by rivals or law enforcement, but quietly surrounded by the echoes of a life defined by extraordinary intellect, subtle power, and enduring influence. His story is a meditation on the nature of control, the fragility of loyalty, and the extraordinary lengths a man must go to survive in a world ruled by fear, ambition, and violence. He proved that true mastery lies not in the visible displays of power, but in the quiet, patient, and deliberate shaping of events, an approach that left him untouchable when others fell, and immortal in the annals of organized crime. The legend of Frank Costello endures because it embodies contradictions. A man simultaneously ruthless and refined, visible yet invisible, feared yet admired. His life challenges our understanding of power, survival, and strategy, offering lessons that extend far beyond the criminal underworld. He was a man who walked in both light and shadow, whose brilliance lay not in the strength of his arm but in the acuity of his mind. And though the world may never fully know the extent of his influence, the echoes of Frank Costello's life continue to resonate, a haunting reminder that in the game of power, subtlety, intelligence, and foresight can create a legacy more enduring than violence ever could. Even today, decades after his death, one question remains. Was Frank Costello merely a survivor, or was he the ultimate architect of a world most could not even perceive? The answer, like much of his life, remains a tantalizing mystery, one that ensures the Prime Minister of the Underworld will never be forgotten.